Welcome to AP Econ's 2020 Micro AP Exam Review, and today we're looking at Unit 5, which is Chapter 12. So let's jump right in. Are you living the 5? I'm living the 5. Let's go. Chapter 12, looking at the factor markets and the distribution of income. Now let's talk for a second about what we're talking about here, the factors of production. Think of this as resources. So think of the factors of production as natural resources, things that we're getting from the earth, such as oil or gas or lumber or water. These are all factors of production that are natural resources. Then we have human resources, that's labor, that are used to produce goods and services. And then we also have other types of resources, what we call the capital resources, which are different types of machinery and buildings and things that are used to make products and services. Those are the capital resources that we're using. And then we have the innovation and entrepreneurship, which is the know-how and the brains behind the operation to help innovatively and technologically advance our goods and services so we can continue to produce more and sell more and make more money as a result of it. Profit motive, the incentives here. So factors of production would be any of those things that I mentioned that are used to produce goods and services. And the idea here is that they're sold in factor markets. So anything having to deal with the land, labor, capital that we're talking about here would be sold in factor markets at factor prices. So the land, as I mentioned, would be a natural resource, labor a human resource, physical capital would be the capital resource, as I mentioned, and human capital, such as education or paying for people to go back to school, that would be a part of the human capital that would be included in a capital resource that we have there. So factor distribution of income is essentially looking at how is the total income divided among the resources that we're utilizing in order to produce these goods and services. And we would set factor prices in order to determine how we are going to pay for them and at what rates we would be willing to pay for them. So labor, for instance, is about 70% of the income that we see in the U.S. economy. And oddly enough, it is about 75% of consumer income, consumer purchases that actually impacts our economy as a whole too. So there is a relationship there between the fact that the cost of labor tends to be expensive and that that expense translates into people tend to use that in order to buy more goods, which contributes to the circular flow and the idea that the economy begins and ends with you, which is what we've talked about since the very beginning. So the idea of other things that are added to that, such as I mentioned paying for people to go back to school, paying for other types of benefits that help the company in the long run through the addition or return to human capital. Those are falling into that human capital category and aren't necessarily included in the factor costs because they're not being doled out to every employee. They're doled out as a benefit to employees that choose to pursue that in that particular adventure as a result of what's happening there. So the production function is essentially this idea of how much we're able to produce goods and services based on using these resources, and marginal productivity is telling us how much benefit we're getting from each worker, how much marginal benefit we're getting from each capital resource that is being used or in that production. And that leads us to our total product curve, which you can see here. As we add more laborers, hopefully, we're producing more. Now notice we're still producing more, but each worker is producing less than the previous worker, and that is again going back to that diminishing marginal utility aspect. Diminishing product of labor is the same. The idea here is that as we add workers, we still continue to produce more as a whole, but each individual worker isn't producing as much as the first and second may have been doing because you're adding additional workers to the mix, and that leads to some complications. So as we see, what will happen is we'll be looking at the marginal product of labor and trying to determine the value of that marginal product of labor in order to determine how many workers should we actually have, how many should we actually employ as a result of this. What is the output per worker, and then how many is the sweet spot, the optimal hiring quantity in terms of the workers that we should have here in the market. So the value of the marginal product of labor is essentially, or the VMPL, is the price times the marginal product of labor. And that's essentially the value of that particular product of labor. So what you're looking at here is to try and maximize your profits. So you obviously want to produce at a place in which essentially what you are bringing in is more than or equal to the marginal resource cost that you're paying out. I mean, most businesses want to end up with more revenues than costs, and this goes back to our original equation of MB equals MC, marginal benefit equals marginal cost. And so we will use the idea of the value of the marginal product of labor that will help tell us what the marginal revenue of that product is and how it relates to the marginal resource cost. How much is it costing us for each resource to produce, and how much based on that cost is each product worth, and that is giving us our marginal revenue product, which should be equal to the marginal resource cost. And then looking at that through the models that Krugman has shared with us here on George and Martha's farm, we can look at the marginal product of labor, that change in quantity over change in the worker or the laborer, to determine which, again, it's marginal. So the idea is it's changing, and it looks like it's changing in this example at an equal clip. But the idea here is we're producing more. We're just with the number of workers. The question is, where do we maximize our profits in terms of how many of those employees we should keep on? And that's a great question. So this is where we would look at the MRC equals MRP, and where the marginal resource cost equals the marginal revenue product. That will tell us where our profit maximizing number of workers is. In this case, based on what we see here, you notice that we have a market wage rate of $200, and for that we are best at having 5 workers to maximize our profits. If we were to hire more workers, we would end up paying more than we would be bringing in. Our costs would exceed revenues, and we would actually be losing money. If we brought in fewer workers, our costs, our revenues would exceed our costs, but we may not necessarily be. We may be bringing in more, but that additional worker is also bringing in more that may lead us to that MRP equals MRC. So you may not be maximizing your revenue there either. And so that's where we look at this idea of what is the resource cost of this particular resource, in this case at the $40 per worker, and then the market wage rate, essentially the $200 for those workers, essentially leading to the VMPL, the value of the marginal product of labor at this optimal point. And so 5 workers should be hired in this capacity. In terms of those numbers that we see there. Now, what happens when the labor demand curve needs to shift? This is where we look at P soft, the idea of a factor demand, any changes in the price of a good or other supplies of factors that go into making that good, as well as any technological changes, can cause a shift in the labor demand curve, and can lead to any significant changes in how many workers you should hire as a result of it. So it's important to note that the derived demand is essentially whatever your resources are costing you, the demand for that resource essentially is derived from the demand you need in order of the good to make that resource. So derived demand is essentially, well, if I am making omelets and the cost of eggs is going up, then derived demand says that the cost of my omelets is going up because the derived demand for eggs is rising. And that cost of that resource I'm going to need to pass along to my consumers, to my customers, because of derived demand as a result of that. So I'm either going to have to raise my prices, or I'm going to have to cut costs somewhere, and that's a difficult decision for businesses to make, but they have to make those decisions every day in terms of that. So in this model, you see just an increase in the price of wheat. And let's start with panel A here. So you've got a situation in which the price of wheat is actually falling. So as a result of this shift from VMPL1 to VMPL3, essentially you don't need as many workers anymore at that market wage rate of $200. Because the price of wheat is falling and the price of my wages, remember sticky wages aren't sticky, remember that in macro. The idea here is, well, if I'm still going to be paying $200 in wages and the price of wheat has fallen, I don't need as many workers anymore. I'm going to have to lay off some workers. The same is true if the price of wheat actually rises. Notice the VMPL in this model, the value of the marginal product of labor, again, which is that marginal product of labor times the price. So if the price is impacted, the VMPL is going to shift. In this case, the price is causing a shift of an increase. The increase in price is leading to an increase in the VMPL. And here you're going to need more workers as a result of that increasing price. So the $200 wage rate actually leads to not need 5 workers, but in this case I'm going to need 8 in order to meet the demand based on what is here. So the difference in price really does have an impact, because the value of the marginal product of labor, if that price of the good, remember the value piece is the price, and if the price of your good is rising or falling, that's going to impact the marginal product of labor, the product of how much you can pay for workers and how many workers you can have is going to be indicative based on what you can sell that product for. So that's really what these two graphs are trying to show and trying to address, and leads to our side-by-side graph of the labor market. Now keep in mind, these are people we're talking about. So the supply here is actually supply of workers. And again, we're talking about people. So the idea here is the supply, or the marginal resource cost, is essentially the supply of workers that you see here at S. And the wage rate, if you remember, side-by-side graph, the market overall is determining what the wage rate is, and it's being passed along to firms. The firm is essentially getting what the market will bear in terms of what the wage rate is, and then the demand for those wages, or the marginal revenue product, is essentially what is it we can sell the product for. That essentially is what we're going to be able to pay for our resources, and that determines the quantity of the resources that we're going to buy or hire, if you will. So that's essentially what we see here, and this is imperfect competition. So we'll get to the monopsony at the end of the chapter, where the business actually has a monopoly on labor, or a significant market power. This is imperfect competition, where nobody has market power, and essentially the market is determining what the wage rate is at equilibrium here on the left side. That passes along over to the marginal resource cost, which is labor of the firm, and what they're paying for that isn't something that they can adjust. It is something that they're going to have to pay. Now, there are some shifts that could shift the labor supply, and we'll talk about those in a second, but essentially this is set by the market itself, and if the market changes, then obviously that would change the MRC here, but that the firm has no impact on that. A couple of things to note in terms of market power. Again, in perfect competition, firms don't have that market power. You are paying the same wages as everybody else. There is an efficiency wage model where, like Costco, you're actually paying more for the workers because you want to keep them and you're incentivizing them to stay. Unions also have an impact on some of the market power that we see here, improving working conditions or helping to get pay increases, that kind of thing. Is helping along those lines. But again, that adds to the cost of the resources, and so firms may be less likely to hire as many resources if they have to pay more for them. And then obviously discrimination is a huge factor here in terms of the wage disparities and in trying to address that. It's hard for firms to do that when they have no market power in the marketplace, and so that is where they can kind of, the industry can kind of clamp down on discrimination and discriminatory practices by firms in order to do that. But again, it does create a chilling effect in terms of hiring. So economically speaking, I understand, trying to right the wrongs of discrimination, absolutely. But keep in mind that it creates a chilling effect among firms who then will hire fewer workers as a result of that. So it does have an impact on the overall graph from a firm's perspective in terms of who they hire, especially if unions or others would take action based on that. So it does have an impact on the hiring practice because those resource costs continue to rise. Now, what could shift the labor supply curve? Essentially is if you have more people in the labor supply, if you have more people actually working, and we saw this post World War II. Women didn't want to go back home; they wanted to stay in the workforce, and they did, and that shifted the labor supply curve. So that's where you would see a lot more laborers, and essentially what you see here is the market, the labor supply curve shifting outward or rightward and leading to a lower wage cost as a result of that supply curve shifting outward or rightward. And then the firms can take advantage of that lower wage as well because their resource costs are lower. The demand for the workers will be greater as a result of that. The population changes when you have a higher birth rate or more immigrants coming in. That has an impact. Opportunities, additional opportunities, such as women who were only teachers before and now can join factory jobs and other types of opportunities that are available. Those impact and can shift the labor supply curve. And then the wealth factor, the idea here in terms of income effect can shift the labor supply curve. Anything in terms of a wage increase would have an impact on along the curve, any wage increases, because that's our resource cost. But in terms of the wealth effect, if there's an income change because of differences in the economy and the rising tide lifting all boats, and so as a result, what people are being brought in at is a very different more millionaires, for instance, that are buying more products. That has an impact here and can shift the labor supply curve. And again, depending on which way it's shifting, and this is the industry curve we're talking about here, so the supply of labor is here. Depending on how it's shifting, that can either shift left or right, and right would lead to lower wages, which would cause firms to hire more people. If the supply curve were to shift left, leading to higher wages, then firms would hire fewer people. And we've seen both of those scenarios play out in recent years. And that leads to this idea of the least cost combination. When you're looking at the marginal product of labor versus the marginal product of capital, you want the least cost combination. So you would look at the marginal product of the input, labor or capital, and divide it by the price of that input. They should be equal in terms of the marginal product of the other input divided by the price of that particular input. So if you're looking at the marginal product of labor, it's divided by the price of labor, and that should be equal to the marginal product of capital divided by the price of capital. And you're looking for the least cost combination of inputs. That's going to determine which one you should pursue in terms of hiring, in terms of hiring more individuals, in terms of what decisions you're going to make based on that. Now, As we close out this chapter, let's look at the Monopsony model. And this is a firm that actually is in a smaller area or smaller town or has significant market power in a particular industry. And so as a result, they don't have to abide by this model of what the firms basically what the market is setting. They don't have to pay those wages. So this leads to a monopsony curve that is a little different. Think of it like a monopoly upside down. But the idea here is your resource costs are going to be greater than the supply curve of labor, so you're going to be able to pay less. And you can do that because you're a monopsony. You have market power. So in a monopoly, normally, you would charge at B because you can, right? And you'd be looking at where MRC equals MRP. Essentially, that would be the optimal point, and then you would essentially that would be the quantity at which you'd be producing at MC equals MR. But in a perfect competition, you'd be at where supply meets demand, you'd be producing. But in a monopsony where you have significant market power over labor, you would actually hire fewer people and you would pay them less. Why? Because you have market power. And so you'd actually be paying them at C. Well, why would you do that? Why would workers come to work for you at C? Well, because you have market power. And maybe you're the only game in town. And think of it like in the old days, the steel mill in town is the major employer, and 90% of the people that work there work for the steel mill. And if you're not going to take the wage they're offering, then you're not going to have a job. So you either have to take the wage they're offering at WM or a walk and either move to another town to find another job, or take probably even lower wages somewhere else at another small retail store or something, because the major labor was basically this steel mill in town. And that's what leads to the monopsony labor market, which is essentially the same graph, but the idea is, where are we determining the quantity? Well, it's at MRC equals MRP, but we're not going to pay that because, again, think of it like a monopoly. Instead of going up to the demand curve, we're going to go down to where this intersects the supply curve, and that would be the wage at monopsony that we would be willing to pay. Why are they doing that? Because they can. They have market power. And if people don't like it, they walk, and you get somebody else to take their place. And firms like this usually get people to take the wage because there's not a whole lot of other options in town to be able to do this. And so this is the monopsony effect. So it does, if you look at the wages, this would be the wage in perfect competition. But that's clearly, and the quantity that's produced. So you're hiring a lot more workers and you're paying them more. In a monopsony, you're hiring fewer workers and you're paying them less. So you're going to have a much smaller workforce, and they're not going to be as well paid as what you would see in the perfectly competitive model, where the market actually sets the wage. In a monopsony, the firm is setting that wage, and it's going to be much lower than what the market would bear because they have market power. And that's the biggest difference. Well, hopefully you found this helpful. This is the end of Unit 5 and Chapter 12. I hope you're living the 5. Are you living the 5? I'm living the 5. That closes out microeconomics for 2020. As you know, Chapters 19 and 20, Unit 6, aren't going to be on this year's exam. So Unit 5 is the end. So I wish you the best of luck. Please take a look at all the resources that I've posted on Google Classroom, and live the 5. I know that you will make me proud. You already have. Have a great day. We will see you soon.